The police officers stood frozen, their eyes scanning the document in disbelief. The man they had been called to remove, the man they had assumed was trespassing, was in fact the new owner of Summit Auto Group. The showroom, moments ago buzzing, with whispers and tension, fell into an eerie silence. Employees stopped mid-motion, customers exchanged shocked glances, and the dealership manager, Evelyn Carter, went pale as reality crashed down on her. Just minutes earlier she had called the cops on him, convinced that he didn't belong. Now standing in the center of the dealership, Malcolm Lewis remained calm, his steady gaze locked onto Evelyn as she struggled to process what had just happened. The weight of her mistake was suffocating, but it was too late. There was no undoing what she had done. What would happen next? Would Evelyn face the consequences of her assumptions? And how would Malcolm choose to handle the power shift that had just taken place? Before we dive into the full story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you believe in standing up for justice and equality, hit like and subscribe so you never miss another powerful story. 6 hours earlier, Malcolm Lewis pulled into the parking lot of Summit Auto Group, a high-end dealership that gleamed under the afternoon sun. Rows of luxury vehicles lined the lot, their polished exteriors reflecting the crisp blue sky above. Malcolm parked his modest sedan at the far end of the lot, deliberately choosing a space away from the high traffic areas. He wanted to observe without drawing too much attention to himself. Dressed in a crisp navy blazer over a white button-down shirt, well-fitted slacks, and polished leather shoes, he exuded quiet confidence. His watch, an understated yet elegant piece, rested neatly against his wrist as he adjusted his sleeve. Today was important, not just because he was visiting his new business for the first time, but because he wanted to see how it operated when no one knew who he was. The employees had no idea that ownership had changed hands, and Malcolm intended to keep it that way, at least for now. As he stepped out of his car, the energy of the dealership shifted almost immediately. Across the lot, he noticed the way employees stole glances at him, subtle but unmistakable. A young white salesman, Todd, stood near a gleaming silver SUV, chatting with a potential customer. But the moment his eyes landed on Malcolm, his expression shifted ever so slightly, an almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw, a flicker of something unspoken in his gaze. Malcolm caught it instantly. It wasn't curiosity, it was assumption. He had seen it too many times before. Before Malcolm could take more than a few steps, Todd strode toward him, his smile practiced but laced with something hollow. "Hey man," he said, his tone casual but clipped. "This isn't a rental place, you might want to check down the road." The implication hung in the air, sharp and clear. Malcolm held his gaze steady, his expression unreadable. "I know exactly where I am," he replied evenly. Todd hesitated, clearly expecting Malcolm to either walk away or ask for directions. When neither happened, a flicker of discomfort crossed his face. "Just checking," he muttered before turning back to his conversation. Malcolm exhaled slowly through his nose, steadying himself. He had expected this. What he hadn't expected was that it would happen within the first 2 minutes of arriving. Shrugging off the moment, he continued toward the showroom. As he approached the glass doors, he saw a security guard stationed near the entrance. The man was built like a linebacker, his stance firm, arms crossed over his chest. Malcolm could feel the scrutiny before he even reached the door. As soon as he stepped forward, the guard shifted, blocking his path ever so slightly. "Can I help you?" The words were neutral, but the tone carried an unmistakable edge. Malcolm met his gaze without hesitation. "Just here to browse," he replied. The guard didn't move. "We usually cater to serious buyers," he said, his voice slow and deliberate. Malcolm let the words settle between them. "Define serious buyer," he said, his tone smooth but firm. The guard's eyes flickered, as if reassessing whether this man standing before him was going to be a problem. After a beat, he stepped aside, but not before muttering, "Just don't touch anything unless you ask first." Malcolm inclined his head slightly, a silent acknowledgement that he had heard the warning loud and clear. Inside, the dealership buzzed with the smooth hum of commerce. The scent of freshly cleaned leather and polished floors filled the air, and a massive digital display in the center showcased Summit Auto Group's top models. Salespeople, sharply dressed and carrying the air of confidence that came with high-end commissions, darted between desks, closing deals and greeting customers with polished smiles. But as Malcolm stepped inside, he felt the shift. Conversations quieted just slightly, eyes flicked in his direction, then away. No one approached him. No one greeted him. Instead, he became a presence that was acknowledged but not welcomed. He took his time, moving deliberately between the vehicles, taking in every detail. He ran his hand along the sleek exterior of a deep blue luxury sedan, noting the craftsmanship, the attention to detail. He had always appreciated a well-made car, not just for the status it carried, but for the artistry of its design. But as he moved from one model to the next, he remained acutely aware of the eyes on him. Minutes passed, and still no one approached. He watched as other customers entered, each one met with a warm smile and immediate assistance. A well-dressed man in his 50s was quickly escorted to the showroom floor, a salesperson already, launching into a pitch about engine power and performance. A young couple barely had to glance at a car before a salesman eagerly approached them with an offer to discuss financing. And yet Malcolm stood there entirely ignored. He wasn't invisible. They had seen him the moment he walked in. They had simply chosen not to acknowledge him. It was an old trick. If you pretend someone isn't there, maybe they'll take the hint and leave. He wasn't leaving. Finally, a voice cut through the room, sharp and direct. "Can I help you?" He turned to see a woman standing a few feet away, arms crossed. Evelyn Carter. He recognized her from the employee files. Dealership manager. Over 15 years of experience. Praised for her efficiency, known for her no-nonsense approach, and, as Malcolm was quickly learning, for something else too. He met her gaze, offering a polite smile. "Just browsing," he said. Evelyn's eyes scanned him, her expression unreadable, but her posture tight. She didn't smile back. "Browsing," she repeated, her tone flat. "Well, if you're looking for financing options, our team can guide you. But unless you're serious about buying today, we prefer to focus on active customers." The words were cool, clipped, dismissive. Malcolm held her gaze for a moment longer, then nodded slightly. "I appreciate the information," he said, his voice calm. "I'd like to look around a bit more if that's okay." Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line. "Just don't touch anything without asking first," she said curtly before turning on her heel and walking away. As he continued his quiet observations, he could feel the atmosphere remain tense. Employees whispered to each other, their eyes darting in his direction. He caught glimpses of their uncertainty, their hesitation. Some of them seemed to sense something was off about the way Evelyn had treated him, but no one spoke up. It wasn't long before Evelyn reappeared, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. This time her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, her expression thinly veiled irritation. "I noticed you've been wandering around for a while," she said, her voice dripping with suspicion. "If you're not planning to buy, I'll have to ask you to leave. We don't have time for distractions." Malcolm looked up from the specs of an SUV he had been reviewing. His calm demeanor remained intact, but his voice carried quiet authority. "I'm not distracting anyone," he said simply. "I have every right to be here." Evelyn scoffed. "Look," she said, exasperated. "I've seen this before, people coming in, wasting time, pretending they're interested. We're running a business here. If you're not buying, you need to go." A few employees exchanged uneasy glances. Malcolm's gaze didn't waver. "I think you're making some assumptions about me," he said evenly. Evelyn's eyes narrowed, her irritation now bordering on hostility. "And I think I know my job," she snapped. "Either show me you're serious or I'll handle this my way." The tension in the room thickened, drawing the attention of nearby employees. They watched silently, unsure of what to do. The stage was set for a confrontation, but Malcolm remained composed, He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He simply met Evelyn's sharp gaze with an unshakable calm that only deepened her frustration. And that was just the beginning. Evelyn's gaze was sharp, her patience worn thin, and the condescension in her tone was impossible to ignore. Malcolm, however, remained composed, standing tall, his expression unreadable. His silence, his refusal to react emotionally, only seemed to aggravate her further. "I've asked you to leave," she said, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. "If you refuse to cooperate, I will have no choice but to call security." Around them, employees and customers had begun to take notice. Conversations quieted. The low hum of the showroom replaced by an awkward tension that lingered between every polished car and every pristine desk. A few employees exchanged nervous glances, some instinctively stepping away, as if afraid to be caught in the growing storm. One young salesman, clearly uneasy, shifted from foot to foot as if debating whether to intervene. But Evelyn's presence kept him rooted in place. She had built her reputation on being tough, and no one wanted to challenge her authority. Malcolm, meanwhile, exhaled slowly, his eyes steady. "Call security," he said evenly. "Go ahead." There was no challenge in his voice, just a quiet confidence that seemed to unsettle her. Evelyn hesitated for just a second, but it was long enough for Malcolm to recognize it: doubt. She wasn't expecting resistance, at least not the kind that wasn't loud, angry, or aggressive. His calm threw her off balance, and yet she wouldn't back down. With an irritated sigh, she pulled her phone from her pocket and tapped the screen, making a show of calling security. "Yes, I have. A man in the showroom who refuses to leave," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "He's being uncooperative and making customers uncomfortable." That last part, the bit about making customers uncomfortable, was intentional. A way to escalate the situation without merit, to justify her actions even when Malcolm had done nothing wrong. It was a game he had seen played too many times before, and yet, watching it unfold in real time was no less infuriating. He clenched his jaw but remained outwardly calm. Security arrived within minutes. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a pressed uniform, his expression unreadable as he approached. Evelyn turned to him, waving a hand in Malcolm's direction. "This man has been loitering," she said briskly. "Wandering around, taking notes on his phone, refusing to leave. I've asked him multiple times, but he's insisting on staying." The guard turned to Malcolm, his posture neutral but his eyes assessing. "Sir, is there a reason you're refusing to leave?" he asked. Malcolm studied him for a moment before responding. "I haven't refused to leave," he said simply. "I've been browsing, just like any other customer. I've spoken to no one except Ms. Carter here, who seems to have decided I don't belong." Evelyn scoffed, folding her arms tighter. "You've been here for nearly an hour, doing nothing but walking around and staring at cars. That's not browsing, that's wasting time." Malcolm tilted his head slightly, letting her words settle between them. "Would you have said the same thing if I looked different?" he asked, his voice quiet, but firm. Evelyn's expression twisted in irritation. "Oh, don't start with that," she snapped. "This has nothing to do with anything except the fact that you're not here to buy." "And how do you know that?" Malcolm asked. His question silenced her for half a second, a flicker of hesitation crossing her face before she masked it with another scoff. The security guard cleared his throat, shifting his stance. "Sir, if management is asking you to leave, I have to enforce that." Malcolm let out a slow breath, his patience tested, but still he refused to raise his voice. "I understand," he said, "but before I go, I'd like to speak to someone higher up." The request made Evelyn laugh dryly. "Higher up?" she echoed, shaking her head. "I am the highest authority here. There's no one else for you to speak to." That, Malcolm thought, was the moment she sealed her fate. There was no one else, she had said. And yet the truth was standing right in front of her. He held her gaze for a long moment, then slid his hands into his pockets. "Good to know," he said simply. Evelyn's lips parted slightly, as if sensing for the first time that something wasn't quite right. but she quickly dismissed whatever doubt had begun to creep in. "Escort him out," she instructed the security guard, waving her hand dismissively. The guard hesitated, perhaps because something about Malcolm's demeanor didn't match what he had been told. But after a moment, he gestured toward the exit. Malcolm gave one final glance around the showroom, taking in the employees who had stood by, the customers who had observed in silence, the weight of the unspoken rules that dictated who belonged and who didn't. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out. Evelyn watched, her arms still folded, her stance still firm, but there was something else in her posture now. Uncertainty. Outside, Malcolm leaned against his car, pulling out his phone and scrolling through emails. His heartbeat was steady, his mind clear. He could have revealed himself right then, could have turned back and watched as the truth unraveled before Evelyn's eyes. But no, he wanted her to sit in the consequences of her assumptions just a little longer. The real moment of reckoning was still to come. What do you think Evelyn will do once she realizes the truth? Will she try to backpedal, or will she double down on her mistake? Comment number 1 if you think she'll try to talk her way out of it, and stay tuned to see how this all plays out. Malcolm remained outside for several minutes, his fingers idly scrolling through his phone. But his mind was razor sharp, absorbing every detail of the encounter that had just unfolded. Evelyn had been so quick to dismiss him, so eager to get him out of her dealership, that she hadn't once considered she might be making a mistake. The layers of arrogance and unchecked bias had built over time, hardened into something immovable. And yet Malcolm knew from experience, people like her always believed they were right, until they weren't. He adjusted his blazer, took a slow breath, and then, without hesitation, walked back toward the entrance of the dealership. The glass. Doors slid open smoothly as he stepped inside once more, and this time, he saw the exact moment Evelyn spotted him. Her entire posture stiffened, her lips pressing into a thin, irritated line. She turned to one of the salesmen near her, gesturing subtly toward Malcolm. The young man hesitated before quickly nodding and stepping toward him. "Sir, I believe you were asked to leave," he said, his voice careful but firm. Malcolm studied the salesman for a brief moment, noting the flicker of unease in his expression. He was simply following orders, likely aware that something about the situation didn't feel right, but unwilling to challenge it. "And I believe I still have every right to be here," Malcolm responded evenly. "I'm a customer, am I not?" The young man swallowed, his eyes darting to Evelyn, who was already striding toward them with clipped steps. "I'm not sure what you think you're doing," she said, her tone clipped and authoritative. "But I don't have time for this." Malcolm remained perfectly still, letting her frustration build as she stood before him, radiating impatience. "I told you once, and I'll tell you again. You need to leave." Malcolm met her gaze with an unwavering calm. "Or what?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. "You'll call security on me again?" Evelyn let out a humorless chuckle, shaking her head. "You think this is funny? I don't know what your game is, but I'm done playing." Malcolm didn't move, didn't react, and that only fueled her growing irritation. She turned her attention to the same security guard from earlier, who had been watching the exchange from a distance. "I want him out," she said sharply. "Now." The guard hesitated this time, shifting his weight slightly before nodding and stepping forward. "Sir, you've been asked to leave. We can't have disruptions in the showroom." Malcolm exhaled slowly, glancing around the dealership. Customers were now openly staring, some whispering to one another. A young couple by the front desk looked visibly uncomfortable, the woman nudging her partner as if urging him to look away. A few employees had their heads down, pretending to focus on paperwork, but their ears were undoubtedly tuned in. It was a spectacle now, and Evelyn seemed to thrive on the authority she wielded in front of an audience. Malcolm took another moment, then finally reached into his pocket. For a split second, he caught the briefest look of apprehension on Evelyn's face, her muscles tensing slightly as if expecting him to produce something dangerous. The moment passed in an instant, but it was there, undeniable, involuntary. Malcolm pulled out his wallet, flipping it open to reveal a neatly folded document inside. He retrieved it with deliberate care and held it out toward the security guard. "Before you force me out," he said, his voice as steady as ever, "I suggest you read this." Evelyn let out an exasperated sigh. "Oh, for the love of... just take him out already." But the security guard hesitated, eyeing the document before reluctantly reaching for it. He unfolded the paper, scanning its contents, and as he read, his entire demeanor shifted. His brows furrowed, his eyes flicking back up to Malcolm, then back to the paper, then to Evelyn. He swallowed hard. "Ms. Carter." His voice had lost its earlier certainty. "You might want to see this." Evelyn rolled her eyes. "I don't have time for whatever nonsense he's trying to pull." The guard hesitated only for a second before stepping toward her, holding the paper out for her to take. "Ma'am," he said, his voice now carrying an unmistakable note of caution, "I think you really need to see this." Evelyn snatched the document from his hand, barely glancing at it before snapping, "What is this supposed to be?" But as her eyes moved across the words, her breath hitched ever so slightly. She blinked, rereading, her brain struggling to process what she was looking at. Her grip on the paper tightened. Then, as if she had been scalded, she tore her gaze away and looked up at Malcolm. "No," she said, shaking her head. This isn't real." Malcolm said nothing, merely waiting. Evelyn's throat worked as she swallowed, glancing back down at the document, her eyes desperately searching for some indication that it was a forgery, a joke, anything other than what it truly was. But there was no mistake, no misunderstanding. The name printed at the bottom of the page was his. Her breath came just a little faster now, her chest rising and falling with the slow, creeping realization of what she had done. Malcolm allowed the silence to stretch, to settle over the dealership like an unforgiving weight. And then, finally, he spoke. "You said you were the highest authority here," he said, his voice even and composed. "That there was no one else I could speak to." Evelyn's lips parted slightly, as if trying to find a response, but no words came. "It seems," Malcolm continued, "that was incorrect." Evelyn's face was a battlefield of emotions, shock, disbelief, a flicker of something dangerously close to panic. She opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again. She started, but no excuse could undo what had already unfolded before an audience. The employees, the customers, even the security guard. They had all seen it. They had all witnessed her dismiss him, belittle him, attempt to throw him out of a business he now owned. Malcolm turned slightly, his gaze sweeping across the showroom, taking in the silent observers. He had spent years dealing with people like Evelyn, people who never once questioned their assumptions until it was too late. But today, she had set the stage for her own reckoning. "I was told to leave," Malcolm said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the showroom, "because I didn't belong here, because I wasn't a serious buyer." He let the words settle, his tone never rising, never growing sharp, but there was no mistaking the gravity of what he was saying. "And yet," he continued, glancing back at Evelyn, "I believe I'm more serious about this dealership than anyone else here." Evelyn took a half step back, looking utterly lost, her once unshakable confidence crumbling in real time. Employees were now exchanging glances, a few of them shifting uncomfortably, clearly uncertain of what came next. Malcolm, however, was certain. "The way I was treated today is unacceptable," he said simply. "Not just as a customer, but as a human being." Evelyn's face burned with humiliation, her fingers twitching slightly as if wanting to tear the document in half and make this entire situation disappear. But there was no escape now. Malcolm had given her every opportunity to do the right thing, and she had chosen, at every turn, to double down instead. And now, it was time for consequences. Evelyn's face was drained of color, her grip on the document tightening as if holding onto it could somehow change the reality printed on the page. The air in the showroom had turned suffocatingly tense, the weight of Malcolm's quiet authority, pressing down on every employee, every customer who had been pretending not to listen. Malcolm remained still, his expression unreadable, waiting to see how she would respond. But Evelyn, for all her years of control, for all her certainty that she was untouchable in her position, did what people like her often did when cornered. She doubled down. With a sharp inhale, she straightened her blazer, squared her shoulders, and let out a short, forced laugh, though there was no humor in it. "I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing," she said, her voice strained but still carrying the edge of someone desperately clinging to authority. "But I don't appreciate being made a fool of." The hypocrisy of her words almost made Malcolm laugh, but he remained calm, merely tilting his head slightly. "A fool," he repeated, his tone even. "You did that to yourself." The murmur of the watching employees grew louder. A few of them exchanged uncertain glances, some shifting uncomfortably as they realized Evelyn's next move wasn't going to be an apology. It was going to be another mistake. She turned toward the security guard again, her voice regaining some of its earlier sharpness. "Escort him out, now." But this time the guard didn't move. He stood still, his jaw tightening as he glanced at Malcolm, then back at Evelyn, as if processing the full implications of what was unfolding. Malcolm could see it, the hesitation, the realization that he had been dragged into something far bigger than a simple trespassing call. But Evelyn, blinded by her own stubbornness, refused to see the writing on the wall. Her gaze flickered around the room, catching the wary looks of her employees, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. She was losing control. And so, instead of admitting her mistake, she did something worse. She reached for her phone. "If security won't handle this, I will," she snapped, her fingers moving rapidly as she dialed. Malcolm watched her, unblinking. He could already guess what she was doing, and sure enough, as soon as the call connected, her voice dripped with the false urgency of someone fabricating a crisis. "Yes, this is Evelyn Carter, manager of Summit Auto Group. We have a disturbance. At our dealership, a man refusing to leave despite multiple requests. He's becoming aggressive, and we need officers dispatched immediately." Malcolm didn't flinch, but he noticed the way several employees tensed at her words. Aggressive? It was a calculated lie, a subtle but dangerous framing that she knew could turn the situation into something far more volatile. And the worst part? She had said it with absolute certainty, as if expecting everyone in the room to go along with it. A few of the employees looked downright uncomfortable now, their gazes darting toward Malcolm, then to each other, as if silently debating whether to intervene. But no one spoke up. No one challenged her. Evelyn, meanwhile, ended the call with a satisfied nod, slipping her phone back into her pocket as she crossed her arms. "I suggest you wait outside," she said, her voice regaining its smug confidence. "You're about to learn that actions have consequences." Malcolm let out a slow breath, the corners of his mouth lifting ever so slightly. It wasn't a smile. It was something far colder, far sharper. "You're right," he said quietly. "Actions do have consequences." The words hung between them, thick with meaning, but Evelyn was too caught up in her false sense of control to hear the warning beneath them. A few moments passed in near silence, the tension stretching unbearably thin, until the distant wail of sirens broke through the heavy air. Employees shifted uncomfortably. A few customers pretended to browse, their eyes flicking toward the entrance. Every few seconds, the young salesman from earlier, Todd, looked downright nauseous, his fingers gripping the edge of the counter in front of him. And then, the glass doors slid open, and two uniformed police officers strode inside. Evelyn immediately stepped forward, her demeanor shifting into one of exaggerated professionalism. "Officers, thank you for coming," she said smoothly, gesturing toward Malcolm without hesitation. "This man has been causing a disturbance. We've asked him to leave multiple times, but he's refused to cooperate. He's making customers uncomfortable." The officers glanced at Malcolm, their expressions unreadable. One of them, a tall, broad-shouldered man with sharp eyes, studied him for a beat longer than necessary. "Sir," he said, his tone neutral, "can we speak with you for a moment?" Malcolm nodded once, slipping his hands into his pockets. his movements slow and deliberate. "Of course," he replied, his voice as calm as ever. He could feel Evelyn's eyes on him, waiting for him to stammer, to panic, to show any sign that he was intimidated. But he wasn't, not even a little. "Would you like me to step outside?" he asked, his gaze flicking briefly toward Evelyn before returning to the officers. The taller officer exchanged a glance with his partner, then nodded. "That would probably be best." Malcolm moved toward the exit at an unhurried pace, stepping just outside the doors. The officers followed, standing a few feet away from him. Inside, the employees hovered near the windows, their faces barely concealed behind reflections of the sunlit lot. Evelyn stood near the entrance, arms still crossed, watching with a smug expression. She thought she had won. She thought she had successfully framed the narrative in her favor. Malcolm let her have that belief for a few more seconds. Then, with the same deliberate movements, he reached into his blazer pocket and pulled out the document once more. This time, he unfolded it fully, holding it up so the officers could read it. The moment their eyes scanned the words, their entire demeanors shifted. The shorter officer let out a quiet breath, his eyebrows rising slightly. The taller one, the one who had spoken first, blinked once, then twice, his eyes flickering from the document to Malcolm and back again. You're the new owner?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. Malcolm gave a single, measured nod. "Finalized the acquisition last week," he confirmed. "I decided to come in today to observe the operations. I wanted to see how the dealership was being run, without my presence being announced." The taller officer let out a slow breath, the realization settling in. He turned slightly, glancing toward the showroom through the glass. Evelyn was still watching, her expression unreadable, but Malcolm could see the moment the truth began to dawn on her. It was in the way her arms lowered just slightly, in the way her jaw tightened, in the way her confident posture suddenly looked far more rigid. The taller officer turned back to Malcolm, his expression now cautious. "Would you like us to handle this?" he asked carefully. Malcolm considered the question for a moment, then shook his head. "No need," he said smoothly. "I'll take care of it." The officer gave a small nod, seemingly relieved that this wouldn't escalate further. He turned toward his partner. "Let's wrap this up," he muttered, and together they walked back toward the entrance. Evelyn took a small step forward, her body language shifting almost imperceptibly, as if realizing for the first time that something was very, very wrong. The officers re-entered the showroom, their gazes now unreadable. "Ma'am," the taller one said, addressing Evelyn directly, "it looks like there's been a misunderstanding." The words alone should have been innocuous, but the tone in which they were spoken made the blood drain from her face. A beat of silence stretched unbearably long. Then, finally, Malcolm stepped back inside, his movements slow, purposeful. He let his gaze sweep the room once, let it rest briefly on the employees, on the customers, on the security guard who now looked more uncomfortable than ever. And then, finally, he turned his attention back to Evelyn. "I believe you were saying something about consequences," he asked, his voice deceptively light. The blood in Evelyn's veins turned to ice. "Do you think Evelyn deserves a second chance, or has she already sealed her fate?" Comment number 1 if you believe actions should have consequences, and stay tuned to see how this all plays out. Evelyn's world was unraveling before her eyes, but she still refused to fully accept it. Her fingers twitched as her gaze darted between Malcolm, the officers, and the growing number of employees who were no longer even pretending to work. Every single person in the room was now watching her, waiting to see what she would do next. The hum of the dealership, the chatter of customers, the clinking of coffee cups from the break room, all of it had fallen into an oppressive silence. It was as if the weight of her mistake was pressing down on the very walls of the building. The officers had said it plainly. There had been a misunderstanding, but the look in their eyes told her something else, that they were holding back, out of professionalism, that they had seen this kind of situation before, and that they knew exactly what she had done. And Malcolm, the man she had tried to throw out, the man she had humiliated, the man she had accused of being aggressive, stood before her with a steady, unreadable expression, waiting, Waiting for her to do what exactly? Apologize? Admit she had been wrong? The very thought made her stomach twist into knots. Her throat was painfully dry when she finally managed to speak. There must be some mistake, she stammered, her voice uncharacteristically unsteady. You're saying you own this dealership? Malcolm let the silence stretch just long enough for the discomfort to settle before responding. That's exactly what I'm saying, he said simply, his voice even and unwavering. Evelyn's head shook in disbelief, but the piece of paper still clutched in her hand told her otherwise. She forced herself to look at it again, reading the name at the bottom, the unmistakable signature of the new owner, and her stomach lurched. She wanted to call it fake, to claim it was a setup, but she knew better. The officers had already verified it. The security guard had read it. And the employees, her employees, had already begun whispering, their hushed voices threading through the tension like cracks forming in glass. The walls were closing in, and Evelyn Carter had nowhere to go. For the first time since she had started working at Summit Auto Group, she had no control over the situation. She had always been in charge, the one calling the shots, the one everyone answered to. She had built her reputation on being firm, decisive, in command. And yet, in this moment, she was powerless. She had spent the past hour treating Malcolm like an intruder, speaking down to him, dismissing him. And now, he could fire her with a single word. The realization of it hit her like a punch to the gut. Malcolm watched the emotions flicker across her face: anger, disbelief, panic. It wasn't the first time he had seen someone like Evelyn struggle with the weight of their own actions. People like her weren't used to consequences. They were used to being right even when they were wrong. He let her sit in it for a moment longer before speaking again. "You assumed I didn't belong here," he said, his voice calm, almost measured. "You assumed that because I wasn't dressed the way you expected, because I wasn't the kind of customer you're used to catering to, that I didn't deserve to be treated with respect." Evelyn's lips parted slightly as if searching for a defense, but there was none. "Not this time. You called security on me," Malcolm continued, his voice still steady but carrying a new weight. "Then, when that didn't work, you called the police. And when that didn't work, you tried to frame it as a misunderstanding." Evelyn felt something close to humiliation creeping into her chest, something foreign and uncomfortable. It was different from embarrassment. Embarrassment was something temporary, something you could brush off. This was worse. This was a mistake with consequences. A mistake she had made in front of her employees, in front of her customers, in front of the very people she was supposed to lead. A mistake that would not be forgotten. One of the employees, a young woman at the reception desk, shifted uncomfortably, her hands clenched together as if debating whether to speak. She had seen it all. They all had. But none of them had stopped it. A nervous glance passed between a few of the salesmen, a silent question hanging between them. What happens now? Malcolm, however, wasn't finished. He turned his gaze away from Evelyn, addressing the room instead. His voice carried the weight of someone who wasn't just speaking for himself, but for every single person who had ever been dismissed, disrespected, or judged before they even had a chance to prove themselves. "The way I was treated today isn't just about me," he said, his eyes sweeping across the faces of the employees who had stood by, the customers who had witnessed everything in silence. "It's about the kind of workplace culture that's been allowed to exist here, the kind of environment that lets people in positions of power make assumptions instead of decisions, the kind of culture that values appearances over substance." The employees didn't move, didn't speak. Some of them shifted awkwardly, their gazes dropping to the floor, while others looked directly at Evelyn, their expressions unreadable. She could feel it, the way the tide was shifting, the way the control she had wielded so effortlessly before was now slipping through her fingers. Her pride screamed at her to fight back, to find some excuse, to salvage what little authority she had left, but deep down she knew it was pointless. Malcolm wasn't bluffing, he wasn't here to argue, he wasn't here to negotiate. He was here to set a precedent. And then, finally, the moment she had been dreading arrived. Malcolm turned, back to her, his voice colder now, final. "Effective immediately," he said. "You're no longer the manager of this dealership." The words hit her like a physical blow. Her breath caught in her throat, her vision narrowing as the full weight of what had just happened settled onto her shoulders. For the first time in 15 years, she was no longer in charge, no longer the one who made the decisions, no longer anything. A few gasps echoed through the room. One of the junior salesmen took an instinctive step back. The receptionist at the front desk covered her mouth with her hand. No one had expected him to say it out loud, not like that. Evelyn's knees almost buckled. Her pride screamed at her to protest, to argue, to find a way out of this. But what could she say? She had dug this grave herself. She had set this chain of events into motion, and now she had to live with it. She opened her mouth, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please," she murmured, for the first time in her career, sounding small. I didn't know." Malcolm's expression remained unreadable. "And that," he said, "is exactly the problem." The silence that followed was deafening. Evelyn could feel the eyes on her, feel the way the employees, her former employees, were looking at her now, not with fear, not with respect, but with something else entirely. Disappointment. She had always told herself she was good at her job, that she had earned her position, that she was a leader. But what kind of leader does what she just did? The answer was clear. And so, with nothing left to say, Evelyn Carter turned and walked toward the exit. The heels that had once clicked with such authority against the tiled showroom floor now sounded different, weaker. The employees didn't speak. They barely even moved. And as the glass doors slid open and Evelyn stepped outside for what she knew would be the last time, the last thing she heard was Malcolm's voice, calm, steady, unshaken. "This dealership will be different now," and then the doors shut behind her. The silence in the dealership felt almost unnatural in the wake of Evelyn Carter's departure. For years, her presence had dominated this space, her voice sharp, her authority unquestioned. Now, she was gone. And in her absence, an unspoken tension lingered, a mixture of shock, uncertainty, and something else entirely. Employees stood frozen. Customers glanced at one another, processing the spectacle they had just witnessed. Malcolm remained at the center of it all, his stance composed, his face unreadable. He could feel the weight of their stares, the unspoken questions hanging in the air like thick fog. What happens next? The dealership had just been thrown into chaos, and all eyes were on him. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, one of the junior salesmen, Todd, the same man who had assumed Malcolm was lost when he first arrived, took a hesitant step forward. His fingers twitched at his sides, and when he spoke, his voice wavered. "Sir, He hesitated, as if unsure whether to continue, then swallowed hard and forced himself to go on. I didn't know." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Malcolm studied him, recognizing the discomfort, the regret, the underlying fear. Todd, like many others in the room, had been complicit, not by his actions, but by his silence. And now, faced with the fallout, he was trying to figure out where he stood. Malcolm let out a slow breath, letting the tension settle before speaking. "And what would you have done if you did?" His voice wasn't harsh, but it carried a weight that made Todd flinch slightly. The young salesman opened his mouth, then closed it, struggling for an answer. Around them, other employees shifted uncomfortably. No one wanted to be the next to speak. No one wanted to acknowledge the truth that had just been laid bare in front of them. Evelyn had been removed, but that didn't erase the culture she had fostered here. The quiet complacency, the unspoken rules, the way people like Malcolm were, treated differently before they had a chance to prove themselves. A long silence stretched between them, before Malcolm finally continued. "Let me be clear," he said, his voice steady, carrying across the room. "I didn't come here today to make an example out of anyone. I didn't come here looking for a confrontation. I came here to see how this place operates. to see how my employees conduct themselves when they think no one is watching." His gaze swept across the room, making sure each person felt the weight of his words. "And what I saw," he let the sentence linger, watching as several employees looked away, guilt etched across their faces. It wasn't good enough. Another silence, heavier this time. Then, finally, the receptionist, the young woman who had been watching with wide, uncertain eyes since the beginning of the ordeal, spoke. Her voice was quiet, but there was an underlying strength to it. "What happens now?" she asked. It was a simple question, but it carried layers of meaning. Malcolm considered her for a moment before answering. "Now," he said, "things change." He turned, walking toward the front of the showroom, addressing the room with the same quiet authority that had just unraveled everything they thought they knew. "This dealership will not operate the way it has in the past," he said. "We will not tolerate discrimination. We will not tolerate employees making assumptions about customers based on how they look, what they drive, or how they dress. That ends today." The words landed with finality, a declaration of a new order. But Malcolm wasn't finished. He turned his attention back to the employees, his gaze sharp. "For those of you who stood by and said nothing when you saw what was happening today," he let the words settle, watching the way several of them shifted, their postures stiff. "You need to ask yourselves why." Few of them lowered their heads, unable to meet his gaze. Others looked visibly uncomfortable. Todd clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as if bracing himself for what was coming next. "If you can't uphold the new standard of this dealership," Malcolm continued, "then you don't belong here." The message was clear. This wasn't just about firing one manager. This was about changing the very foundation of how this business operated. And Malcolm wasn't going to tolerate anyone standing in the way of that. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, slowly, the same young receptionist nodded, straightening her spine as if finally making a decision. "I want to be part of that change," she said. Her voice was quiet, but there was no hesitation. "Me too," another voice added. A salesman from across the room, one who had stayed silent during the confrontation but now looked determined. Then another, and another. One by one, employees began to nod, some more hesitant than others. But the shift was undeniable. Malcolm studied them carefully, noting the sincerity in their expressions. He didn't expect perfection. Change wasn't instant. But this was a start. He gave a slow nod, the corners of his mouth lifting just slightly. "Then let's get to work." The energy in the room changed almost immediately. The tension wasn't gone, but it was evolving, transforming into something new. Employees exchanged glances, some more relaxed now, others still wary, but there was movement where before there had been only silence. And for Malcolm, that was enough for now. As the employees slowly dispersed, Malcolm turned toward the entrance. Familiar elderly couple, who had been in the showroom when everything first began, approached him. The man, dressed in a tweed jacket, extended a hand. "Young man," he said, his voice warm but firm. "I don't know who you are, but you handled that with grace." Malcolm shook his hand firmly, offering a small smile. "Thank you," he said, meaning it. The elderly woman beside him nodded approvingly. "It's good to see someone standing up for what's right," she said. "Not just for yourself, but for everyone else here, too." Malcolm let out a slow breath, nodding. That was exactly why he had done this. Not just for himself, but for every employee who had ever been afraid to speak up, for every customer who had ever been treated unfairly, for everyone who had been told, implicitly or explicitly, that they didn't belong. He took one last glance around the showroom, taking it all in. The past, the present, and the future he was about to build. The weight of responsibility settled over his shoulders, but it wasn't a burden. It was a choice, and it was one he was more than ready to carry. As Malcolm stood in the center of the showroom, taking in the weight of the moment, he felt the shift that had begun to settle over Summit Auto Group. It wasn't just about what had happened today. It was about what came next. The employees, once uncertain, were beginning to process the reality of their new leadership, their new expectations, their new responsibilities. The culture that had been ingrained in this place, the unspoken biases that had guided so many interactions, would no longer define how business was done here. Malcolm hadn't come in with the intention of making a spectacle, but sometimes change needed a moment of reckoning, something undeniable that forced people to confront their own actions. And today had been exactly that. He turned toward the receptionist, who still stood near her desk, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She had been one of the few who had shown even a flicker of discomfort when Evelyn had called the police, one of the few who had seemed to recognize the injustice of what was unfolding. "You said you wanted to be part of the change," Malcolm said, his voice even but firm. "Then I need people like you to hold others accountable. This can't just come from me." Her shoulders straightened slightly as she nodded. "I understand." Her voice carried more conviction now, the hesitation from earlier beginning to fade. One by one, the employees who had been standing in clusters throughout the showroom began to move, slowly returning to their stations, their work, though it was clear they were still processing everything that had happened. Malcolm watched as they whispered among themselves, some nodding in quiet agreement, others still uncertain about what this meant for them. That was fine. Change wasn't immediate. It was built, step by step. As he walked toward the main office, the sound of business resuming behind him, he caught sight of Todd, the young salesman who had first assumed Malcolm was lost when he entered. The younger man hesitated before stepping forward, his expression conflicted. "Sir," Todd started, then hesitated, his hands tightening into fists before he forced himself to speak. I made a mistake earlier. I shouldn't have assumed. Well, I shouldn't have treated you the way I did." Malcolm studied him, letting the moment stretch. He could see the discomfort, but also the genuine effort behind the words. Todd wasn't the only one who had to unlearn old habits, but at least he was taking the first step. "I appreciate that," Malcolm said after a pause, "but words aren't enough. I need to see the change in how you treat every customer who walks through these doors." Todd swallowed hard, then nodded. Quickly, "Yes, sir, I understand." Malcolm gave him one last look before continuing toward the office, where the dealership's administrative files were stored. There was still work to be done, contracts to review, policies to assess, and new leadership to put in place. As he stepped inside the office, the quiet of the space contrasted sharply with the energy of the showroom. The walls were lined with shelves of paperwork, records of deals, employee reports, and financial statements. Somewhere among them was Evelyn's file, a record of the years she had spent running this place, making decisions that had shaped the dealership's reputation. Malcolm pulled it from the shelf, flipping through the pages, scanning the performance reviews, the customer complaints that had been quietly dismissed, the employee concerns that had never been fully addressed. It was all there, hidden beneath the surface, waiting for someone to look closely enough. No more. He closed the file, setting it aside. His next priority would be finding a new manager, someone who understood what real leadership looked like, someone who wouldn't make the same mistakes as Evelyn. But for now, there were other matters to handle. He pressed a button on the intercom, his voice calm and steady as it echoed through the building. "Can all department leads meet me in the main conference room in 10 minutes? As he exited the office, he noticed several employees exchanging glances before nodding, moving toward the meeting space with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Malcolm followed, stepping inside the large glass-walled room at the center of the dealership where meetings were held to discuss performance strategies and future plans. The department heads, finance, sales, service, and inventory, filtered in, some adjusting their ties, others folding their arms as they took their seats. He could see the uncertainty in their expressions, the lingering effects of what had just transpired. Some had been loyal to Evelyn, others had simply gone along with the way things had always been. But none of that mattered now. The only thing that mattered was what came next. Once everyone was seated, Malcolm took a moment before speaking, allowing the silence to settle. Then finally he leaned forward, his hands resting on the table. "I know today has been unexpected," he began, his voice even but firm. "And I know some of you are wondering what this means for your future here." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "So let me make one thing very clear. This dealership is going to operate differently from now on. The culture that existed here before, it's done. The way things have been run, that's changing." Some of the department heads shifted in their seats, but none of them spoke. "If you're here because you believe in doing your job the right way, in treating customers with respect, in holding yourself and others to a higher standard, then you'll have no problem adapting to these changes. But if you can't commit to that, if you think you can keep doing things the way they've always been done, then this might not be the place for you." A long pause followed. Then finally, the finance manager, a woman in her late 50s who had been working in the industry for decades, cleared her throat. "And if we want to stay?" she asked carefully. Malcolm met her gaze, his expression unwavering. "Then you prove it," he said simply. "Not just to me, but to every person who walks through those doors." She nodded, seemingly satisfied with the answer. A few of the others followed, exchanging quiet glances before nodding as well. The resistance wasn't completely gone. Some people would take longer to accept the change than others. But Malcolm had expected that. Change wasn't instant, but it was happening. The meeting continued for another half hour as they discussed logistics, transitions, and immediate adjustments that needed to be made. By the time it ended, the energy in the room had shifted. There was still uncertainty, still hesitation, but there was also something else: momentum. Employees who had once felt powerless were beginning to understand that things really were different now, that they had a say, that their voices mattered. As Malcolm stepped out of the conference room, he spotted the same elderly couple from earlier, still lingering near the front of the dealership. They had been there for nearly the entire ordeal, watching as everything unfolded. The man smiled as Malcolm approached, extending a hand once more. "You've got your work cut out for you," he said, his tone light but carrying an unmistakable note of admiration. Malcolm shook his hand firmly. "That's the plan," he replied. The woman beside him nodded approvingly. "We'll be coming back," she said. "I have a feeling this place is going to be different under your leadership." Malcolm exhaled slowly, offering a small, grateful smile. "That's the goal," he said. As they exited the dealership, he turned back, his gaze sweeping across the showroom, the employees, the customers, his business. This wasn't just about a single day, a single incident, or even a single person. This was about building something better, about setting a new standard, about ensuring that no one, customer or employee, would ever be made to feel like they didn't belong again. The future started now, and Malcolm Lewis was ready to lead it. Malcolm Lewis walked out of Summit Auto Group that evening, knowing that today had been more than just a confrontation. It had been a defining moment, not just for Evelyn, not just for the employees, but for the dealership itself. The way business had been run here for years was no longer acceptable. The quiet biases, the unspoken assumptions, the way certain customers were treated differently based on nothing but appearance. All of it had been exposed in a way that could no longer be ignored. Today had been about accountability, about shining a light on behavior that had long gone unchecked. But more importantly, it had been about change. Because while exposing a problem is important, fixing it is what truly matters. Evelyn Carter's downfall had been her arrogance, her unwillingness to reflect, her refusal to even consider that she might have been wrong. She had believed she was untouchable, that her version of the truth was the only one that mattered, and that belief had cost her everything. But she wasn't the only one at fault. The silence of those around her had allowed her to operate unchecked for years. That was the real lesson here. Injustice thrives in silence. It grows in places where people are too afraid or too indifferent to speak up. If even one employee had challenged Evelyn when she began treating Malcolm unfairly, maybe things wouldn't have escalated the way they did, but they had remained quiet, and in that silence they had become complicit. This is the reality of many workplaces, many communities, many interactions that happen every day. Racism and discrimination are rarely as obvious as shouting or violence. More often than not, they exist in subtle assumptions, in the way people hesitate before offering help, in the way certain individuals are monitored more closely than others, in the way someone can be dismissed before they even have a chance to prove themselves. What happened to Malcolm wasn't just about one bad manager. It was about a system, a culture, an environment that allowed someone like Evelyn to act with impunity. That's why the changes he made at the dealership weren't just about firing one person. They were about creating a workplace where respect was not optional, where employees were held accountable for how they treated customers, where silence, in the face of injustice, would no longer be acceptable. It won't be easy. Change never is. There will be resistance. There will be employees who struggle to unlearn old habits. There will be customers who won't like the shift in leadership. But true leadership isn't about making everyone comfortable. It's about doing what's right. Malcolm understood that. He knew that real change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with a decision. And today, that decision had been made. Summit Auto Group would never be the same again. And that was a good thing. So now the question is, what would you have done in this situation? If you were one of the employees standing in that showroom, watching as Evelyn tried to humiliate Malcolm, would you have spoken up? Or would you have stayed silent? Comment below and let us know your thoughts. And if you believe in standing up against discrimination, in holding people accountable for their actions, and in building a world where respect is not based on appearances, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Thank you for watching, and remember, true change starts with us. See you in the next story.